Thank you very much, Dr. Lewis, for your time on the podcast and for joining me. Thank you.
Abhishek, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
Thanks. Let's start with your first recollections. When did you start falling in love with trees and plants? When you would take a break from pogo stick jumping, is what I read in the book.
Well, so, I was born and raised in Hawaii, and I was surrounded by the natural world at every turn. It's very close to you when you're in the islands and you're on an island surrounded by water. My parents also didn't have a television, so they rented one every 4 years for the Olympics. So for 2 weeks we could watch whatever we wanted, but for the other 3 years and 50 weeks we were on our own. And so I spent a lot of time in two different places: in the library, the local public library, which I loved, with its cool marble floors I could just stretch out and read, and out in the natural world as well. So those have really been my two go-to places as a kid, and that really introduced me to the natural world.
Did you try climbing trees as a kid, much like others, or how was it for you?
We had a huge, I did, there are all sorts of strange trees in Hawaii. There are banyan trees, there are trees of all kinds. There are trees with what are called stilt roots that you can kind of clamber up. They're kind of thorny. And we had in our backyard a huge mat of, not really a tree per se, but a huge array of vines that we would bounce up and down on. It was great fun. So, I had a botanical childhood, I suppose it's safe to say.
Lovely. And what was that age? I was talking to a couple of scientists leading up to this year, and they talked about knowing fully well what they wanted to do very early in life. One of them was just 5, the other one was 7. How was it for you, Dr. Lewis? When did you decide that this was the world for you?
It was probably when I was 9 or 10, somewhere in there, I think, before I went off to school. I went to boarding school in 7th grade, but before I went off to school, really I was just surrounded by the natural world. I don't think I wore shoes until I was 12 years old at all, but this is a very rural part of an island, a very remote island in the middle of the Pacific, so that was how we rolled back then.
I live in Mumbai, although in Thane, which is a suburb of Mumbai, and things obviously in cities are very different. How was it growing up for you? One without wearing shoes to start with. Tell us more about that.
Well, it was very rural, and recently I saw a picture of my 5th grade class, my class photo. Not a single one of the kids is wearing a pair of shoes or footwear of any kind. So I think that was good kind of confirmation from the archival record that it was the norm to really behave in that way. And the Hawaii in the 1960s was a very rural place. So it wasn't out of place. It wasn't like it was a big bustling metropolis. It was a relatively small, very rural setting, rainy, very green, sort of riotously populated with, plants and birds and all sorts of things. So probably not that different from parts of India in some ways.
Another common thing that we share is that even we don't have a TV set, and there is one very popular sitcom in the 90s and 2000s called Friends, where there was a joke when somebody says, "I don't have a TV," and the other guy says, "Then where is all the furniture pointing at?" So because that's
funny.
just the way it is. And what was the first oftentimes it's a school teacher or a parent or a relative who indulges us or throws us spotlight on a subject that makes us interested in it. What was it for you? Did you have one moment or many such moments, because you've grown up in that circle?
Yeah.
So when did you first say that this is fascinating for me to study?
I think it was a case of self-discovery, but when I was actually, if you sort of fast forward ahead to my college years, I went to work for a lawyer in Hawaii who was really involved with the big botanical gardens. He was very wealthy, and he had a beautiful library of natural history books, which helped stir my interest in printed books because I work in a research library. But he also was in charge of, or was on the board of trustees of some of these really large botanical gardens on the big island of Hawaii. And so I was surrounded by people who were interested in botany, and so he was probably one of my influences. And of course, my parents, probably most notably my mother, was always pointing out things in the islands. And my brother and sister also were very keen on the natural world. So it's probably a series of activities that got me really invested in the natural world.
And it all has come to a point where you are the author of 12 Trees, the Deep Roots of Our Future. Tell us about the figure 12 to start with.
They do. So, 12 is a very resonant number, and I thought about 10, and I also wanted something that had some consonants. So 10 trees, 12 trees, and both start with the same letter, the same consonant. And so 12 trees seemed better than 10 because I really started with that kind of framework because I could then have 2 more trees to talk about. But 12 is a very resonant number in many different cultures, societies, and religious figures, religious terms, mathematical terms. 12 is a very significant number for a variety of different reasons. And so there's a sort of a unifying aspect, I suppose, to the number 12, beyond the fact that it's a useful number that rhymes kind of with trees.
Yeah. True, and your book starts with a beautiful little anecdote about how trees in Australia had been given email IDs.
Right. Right. I mean, the trees in Melbourne were suffering from drought, and a very large percentage of them were suffering. And so they assigned email addresses to these trees so that people in the community could write to the city foresters and say, look, such and such a tree is in danger. And they were trying to sort of crowdsource these trees for their care. But of course, what ultimately happened was people had an emotional response to these trees. They wrote love letters to the trees, or what I call tree mail in the book. They
Right.
really reached out and had many concerns about the trees, were concerned about them, had very intimate things to say to them. So I put that story in there in the introduction because it said something about how much kinship and how much connectivity people felt with trees without any particular prompting. They offered up these stories, and so it also shows how widespread these feelings are.
And some of the emails, you quote a couple of them, they are like asking for help from a tree. Maybe you've broken up with your girlfriend for all you know, and it's writing to a tree
Right.
so what should I do, dear tree, or whatever.
That's right. I've got feelings for so and so, and it's almost like writing to an advice column for some personal advice about how to manage their relationships, which I found very striking.
What explains that intimacy? I was just telling you before recording the book that this library behind me is that of my young kid. He's just 6, and there are books, whether it's Peppa Pig or,
Yeah, sure.
books that talk about, there's something about planting seeds, trying to grow trees. There are lots of stories around it. Also, the other day, I've got a good friend of mine whose father was telling me that in the place where I live, in the suburb, in the small colony, he looked at 4 trees around me and said, look, that is the one that I planted. That is the one so-and-so friend's dad planted. That uncle so-and-so planted this. So and he's talking very proudly. He's about 65 or 70 now. And they had done this when they were in their 30s, and now kids are playing under it. So there is that kinship, the word that you used. What explains that over the years, centuries?
There's a great quote that says the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago because then they grow. But I think the thing about trees is that everybody recognizes them. Everybody also has a personal kind of experience with them. They've climbed up them. They've watched them go through the seasons. If they're in a part of the world where they're deciduous and they change, they drop their leaves, they grow the leaves back. They have different color leaves. And the other thing about trees is, they're dynamic, so they continue to grow, especially if they're small and you can readily see them grow. I planted a tree in my backyard when my oldest son was born. He's 18 now. And we planted it the week he was born. It almost tipped over in about 2011 during a big windstorm. We winched it back upright and it didn't die, and it's now 50 or 60 feet tall. And so you can people mark the changes of the seasons and the passage of time, I think, with trees. And I think that's because they both are long-lived, but they also change, and so you can see those changes. They keep growing and changing, and I think that is one of the things that people find meaningful about them, and one of the reasons people have some sense of kinship about them. And there are many different kinds of trees. That's the other thing is, there's something like 75,000 different species of trees across the planet, and that means there's an enormous amount of variety. They've evolved and differentiated into lots of different forms while still maintaining, I guess, their treeness, as it were.
Right. I said 75,000 species. In your book you talk about planet Earth having 3 million of them. The figure is that the number of trees that grow every year, or in totality?
3 billion individual trees.
Right, sorry.
Around the planet.
And 3 billion, forgive me. And 30% of dry land is covered by forests, which is a pretty big figure.
Yeah. And and in the past, I think that the tree estate, as they call it, was even greater. Back 100, 200, 300, 1,000 years ago, there were more trees because we've removed so many of them for really industrial and now for commercial reasons. So the quantity of trees, the overall quantity of trees has declined significantly, and all around the world where there are industrial societies. it's changed a lot.
One thing that we expect trees to do is have its relationship with carbon, in terms of it being inseparable. Tell us about it as if you're talking to someone, which you are, who has absolutely no background in botany, the importance of carbon and the whole idea of sequestering a lot of carbon within the roots or within the tree itself, and why that is important for us.
So trees sequester carbon because they need it. It's not like they're just doing it as a service to us and a sacrifice to them. It helps generate photosynthesis. They uptake carbon and they release oxygen, carbon dioxide, and then they release oxygen. And they sequester this carbon not just in their trunks and their leaves, but in their roots. And they're really important carbon sinks, as we call them. And then, of course, when you cut down a tree or you burn a tree down, or you mill a tree, all that carbon gets released back into the atmosphere. And in a way, you're undoing that sequestration that had taken place for a long time. So they hold carbon there, what are called carbon sinks, and that is a really essential function of trees, especially when you multiply that carbon holding effect across billions of individual trees. Trees don't sequester carbon very well when they're young, so every passing year as a tree gets bigger, it's much more effective at its sequestration of carbon.
In terms of trees telling us the story of the planet's past, there are geologists who talk about, they study, excavate and try to look at stones to see what the world was a few hundred years ago or thousands of years ago. How do trees fit in the whole equation, and how does that work? How do trees tell us about our own past?
There are a couple of key ways. The first is through what botanists call dendrochronology, so the study of tree rings. And these tree rings are exceptional, Abhishek. They tell us not just how old a tree is when its rings are counted, but they tell us how much moisture was in the air, what the environmental conditions were like at any given time, what the weather and wind pressures were on the tree. They even can record solar flares and other information from outer space, as strange as that might seem. And they're studied at the microscopic level as well as by the macroscopic level by people interested in all the things that trees can tell us. They've even been able to carbon date, well, not carbon date per se, but to date, because of the rings, they've been able to date things like the picture frames of famous paintings to confirm whether they might or might not be forgeries. They've been used to prove or disprove any number of claims made about archaeological matters, because even dead wood that's been used for buildings retains its record of tree rings, right? You can still count them, and tree rings are really like a fingerprint. So every tree has a very distinctive mark. And so if you build a library of those rings, you can start to understand how other trees with those same patterns nearby might be. So you can learn a lot. The other great dating tool for trees is, at least in the case of this particular book, I talk about amber a great deal, about the fact that the sap that trees release can contain insects and plant matter from millions and millions and millions of years ago in 3 dimensions, unlike fossils, because fossils are essentially flattened, permineralized stone records of the past, whereas these amber, these creatures, usually insects, but as I said, also plants, in amber, are an enormously useful record of a really ancient world. So the tree rings get you back a few thousand years. The amber and its payload of life gets you back millions and millions of years. So those are at least 2 of the ways that trees are great for sort of dating technologies and really coming to understand a very 3-dimensional amount of information about the planet's past.
Yeah, you write, and I quote, that fossils in rock whisper about the climate past, but amber speaks in rich, clear voice. And is that the reason being that amber, which is sticky, you'll have to help me out here, Dr. Lewis, is that it retains the organism within it for longer and you can look at it from all different angles? Is that why the quality is different from as compared to that of a fossil?
So let me try to lay that out clearly. So fossils are rare creations. You have to have something that's laid flat, that's not been torn up by other plants, by other animals, and then it has to be covered over with layers of silt that slowly build up, and over a long period of time, all the organic material in those fossils is removed and replaced with minerals. So essentially it's evidence of the natural world turned to stone. And what you get, with a few rare exceptions, you get really just a flattened, very squashed, poor squash plant or animal. It's rare to find any color in fossils. It's rare, and of course you can't see them in 3 dimensions because again they've been flattened. Amber, on the other hand, enrobes the insects usually or the plant and retains its color. It's what's called an anoxic environment, so there's no oxygen there to degrade the plant, and so So you can see amazing things in 3 dimensions. You can see insects having sex. You can see another insect blowing bubbles in a last ditch effort to escape the amber that has captured it. You can see there's a great drama to be had in the amber that you just don't see in the same way in the stone fossil record.
And talking about drama, you also write that your jaw once sagged the first time you looked at one of these ambers. Which was that? Remind us, please.
It was a blue amber, which is very rare, and we don't know why blue amber exists. We think it's probably something to do with the fire that damaged the tree that released the sap, but it's an extraordinary color. It's this really rich cobalt blue.
Right. I looked up the Google images, and it looks like a rare precious stone from
exactly.
what I see.
It is. And of course, amber's been used as jewelry. Amber's been used as jewelry for millennia. It's been a talisman, right. And it's had its own cultural role that it's played. And there are many different colors of amber too, from yellows to browns to reddish hues. But of course, the blue is exceptionally rare.
Do you collect these when you're out on the field and memorabilia or something to show to your now grown-up son?
I try to. I have for instance, one of my trees is the East Indian sandalwood tree, and I collected a vial. I bought a vial of the sandalwood oil because it's what's called an essential oil, and I did a little math. I think if you scaled up the cost of the vial to what I paid for it to an 8-ounce cup of it, it would be something like $11,000 for a cup of this oil. It's very valuable, and so I like to collect the samples where I can. I have other tree parts like that in my possession. Yes.
And how is a typical day on the field when you are out there trying to study these plants or having to research a book of this kind where you need to dig deep, no pun intended, to, get the details out in a manner that we can wrap our heads around?
Yeah, so I'm a historian by training and a naturalist by inclination, and so my time is a mix of time out in the field and in a library or in a laboratory studying evidence. And of course, the laboratories where these things are studied are indoor spaces, but if you're studying tree rings, for instance, the best work you can do is in a laboratory because you've got clean, dry surfaces, you've got microscopes, you've got other tools that can scrutinize the evidence laid out on a counter in front of you more readily. But I've been on some, for instance, prescribed burns prescribed burns are used in areas where a heavy fire load is dangerous for trees, and so it's a way to kind of thin out the trees and ensure that fires don't get so hot that they burn everything down the next time a fire passes through. So for me, it's really a combination of time outdoors, which I always love, and time indoors, which I equally love. I'm just a geek. I'm a rare book, manuscript, curator, research geek, and so they're both meaningful activities for me.
And you also went to the laboratory of tree ring research in Arizona, is what you write, the world's first and leading facility for the study of tree rings. Now, tree rings, you also said it needs microscopic as well as macroscopic view for you to know what's happening in there. So how was that experience?
Well, I was really shocked to see how much you could learn from these tree rings. I mean, it's not, as I said, not the things, but you can study fire history and fire ecology. You can study archaeology, as I said, old buildings and their timbers. You can study then very much more technical things like, isotope geochemistry and biogeochemistry and numerical and statistical modeling. And you can even study things like, public health and carbon cycles and human societies and interactions. So I was really shocked in a way to understand how broad the work involves, And so this laboratory for tree ring research in Tucson, Arizona, is just a spectacular place. I urge anyone who's in the western United States to take a visit, to take a tour through it, because it's. But I got a nice behind-the-scenes tour from the director, which you don't usually get if you show up with your binoculars and your shorts. But it's a fascinating topic, and there's some really good books written about tree rings and the study of dendrochronology.
And from your book itself, of the 12 books, if I were to ask you to choose, of the 12 trees, if I were to ask you to choose one lesser known story or a surprising one about one of the trees that feature in your book, which one might you pick, one or two?
Which tree or which story?
Oh, either. Let's go with both.
Gosh, there's so many. There's so many good stories. I think it's like saying which is your favorite child, but I think that let me think about that for a minute. I suppose it's the fact that there's hope for trees in a way you might not expect. So one of the things they've done with trees is they've tried planting some of these coast redwood trees. Actually, pick your tree, the baobab tree, the coast redwood tree. They've tried planting some of these trees just slightly outside of their normal ranges to see how they'll do. And in many cases they thrive. And so in the face of a warming climate, I find that a pretty optimistic thing. These trees need help, right? We've pressed our thumb so heavily on the scale of change over the centuries that now it's fall to us to actually figure out what to do to repair some of the things we've really screwed up. And one of the ways to do that is to test these trees to see if there are strategies to make them more resistant. So for instance, the bald cypress tends to grow in brackish water, salty, fresh water mix. As sea level change comes along, it gets saltier and saltier, and it's very hard on the trees. So what botanists have done is they've tried to find ways to manage this. They've tried to find trees that tend to be more saline resistant than others, and to see if they can breed some saline resistance into them. Plant tree breeding and modification is thousands of years old, so there's nothing unnatural about it to try to get trees to do. We've modified plants for higher yields of food. We've been doing things like that for thousands of years. So to modify some of these things to increase their chances for survival does not seem like a pernicious or particularly bad thing. I think it's a way to really help them.
You talked about the coast redwood. And again, forgive my ignorance, Dr. Lewis, I had to look at the images to give me a sense of how big or how different these trees are, because they are unique in their own right. And these trees go straight up into the sky is how the perception of mine was. And you write that the root system of these trees spread nearly 100 feet, and that you can make 33 homes on one street if you had to, use the wood from one tree. Right. Fascinating little stuff like these.
Yeah, I love the little details like that give you because everyone can imagine what a subdivision of houses looks like on a fairly small street. That's from one tree. That's the lumber for all those houses. So I like working these examples in, because they tell you something meaningful about things that are hard to otherwise make sense of. The size of a tree is hard for us to get our heads around. What does 2 million board feet mean to anybody? Not much until you put it in the form of, say, that makes this many houses, and we all can understand. We can all understand something like that, right? So
you say you are also a keen mountaineer. You've climbed a few mountains yourself. Have you tried climbing the coast redwood any time, or would you?
No, I think my climbing days are over. That's the other thing is with 12 trees. I was under contract to write this book in about 3 years, and so I had like 4 months per tree or something, or 3 months per tree, and so I couldn't linger for too long on any one of these trees. But I really had initially had plans to climb one of these trees, but it's not trivial to do so. And they're also, the coast redwoods are very carefully guarded, and the location of the tallest ones, are not easy locks to pick, so to speak. They're hard to get to. They're hard to get people to take you to them, and so there's a lot of bureaucracy involved. And so that would have been a weeks long undertaking. I just ran out of time for it. It's just the hard, cold reality of research on a deadline.
Right, and bureaucracy slows things down. On the other hand, you write about a bird that could fly 100 miles per hour and it would have small nests in the coast redwood.
Yeah, the foglarks, as they're called. This really mysterious little bird that's called a marbled murrelet. I won't bother to. Well, I'll try to give you the scientific name. It's Brachyramphus marmoratus is the scientific name. Because I'm a bird guy, I've written a couple books about birds as well. And they're very secretive, and so its nests went undiscovered for a very long time. Nobody had any idea where they nested until a tree trimmer was up in a tree and trimming this tree about 150 feet up, and he saw this little nest with a strange squash-looking little bird in it, and he accidentally dislodged it, and it fell to the ground. And when you're light, and birds have hollow bones, fell to the ground, and it was perfectly unharmed, and he picked it up and took it to the nearest nature station. And the Audubon Society had offered a $100 reward for anyone that could reveal the nesting location of these birds, and so no one's ever claimed the $100 reward. I've thought about trying to go. So one of the things I do like about all these trees is that there's still mysteries to be had, and there's still things that we don't know about them, whether they're behavioral things, whether they're genetic things or ecological things. Nothing gives up its secrets that easily. And we only have a finite number of tools to figure these things out, and we don't have the budget of the Pentagon to hire enough people to do these things. And so, that's one of the things I like about trees more generally and about the natural world, is there's so much mystery still at play in the natural world, and I think that's really important for people as a form of inspiration, as a form of motivation. I think it's a significant aspect.
And do you see that as compared to the animal kingdom, in terms of even from the consumer standpoint or documentary films or interest, do you think the plant kingdom or the trees, the greenery, that bit doesn't get as much attention, or is it me who's ignorant about it?
I think it's safe to say that animals tend to get more press than plants. That said, there are a lot of books about trees out there. And I was a little worried about that when I started. I thought, my gosh, the market is already kind of saturated with people who've been writing about trees and writing very well. But, I think there's still a great deal to be said about individual trees. And I can say with some confidence that some of these trees have had virtually nothing written, at least in a very popular vein like this, about them. They all show up in the scientific literature. But what I'm really trying to do in a lot of these cases is channel some of that scientific content into layperson's terms that, that the common reader, as it were, can make sense of, And so, I find that to be a meaningful task. And some of these trees, like I said, just like no one's probably ever heard of the Toromiro tree, this little tree from Easter Island. Nobody's probably ever read a book about the ceiba in the last chapter of the book. So. You start reading a bigger literature and you start seeing what other people have written, and you spend a lot of time doing that, and you start assembling a sort of understanding of who's written what about what, and then you get a sense about what you might say that's different from what they've said. You want to offer something that's not just a retread of something that someone else has said.
And the book also contains what I call these small anecdotes of no longer than a paragraph, which you can talk about them at parties if you want to, or talk about them with your friends as trivia. For example, you write about one salamander, I forget which species that was, which could take up to 2 minutes to fall from the tops of these coast redwood trees because of the way they are aerodynamically shaped, and when they are threatened, they just take a leap of faith and they land safely. So
the wandering salamander,
the wandering salamander, is it? Okay. Right.
Yeah.
So I think even the relationship between plants and the animals that burrow through these trees or live up there, it must be a different world. If somebody were to spend some time up there, had there been a habitat for human beings, I'm glad there isn't, because we would have ruined that as well. But if you just sit there, right, there would be quite a lot of things to learn from.
Oh, it's extraordinary how the things that they found up there. They found an 8-foot-tall Sitka spruce growing up in the upper heights of one of these redwoods. Another tall tree growing up in the tree. They found grasses. They found, lichens and mosses. They found things you just wouldn't imagine. Like a lawn of grass, for instance, on one of the trees. And there's crickets and there's beetles and there's earthworms and there's mollusks and amphibians of all kinds. And so they actually build up their own soil, because these canopies have these large flat spaces up in the innards of the canopy. There's a lot of room up there for nature to do what it does, which is to adapt and gain a foothold and grow. It's truly a whole nother world up there.
Yeah, another one is you briefly mentioned the Toromiro tree.
Yeah.
And I like the way you describe it. You call it an expat tree. Why is that?
Because the Sophora Toromiro doesn't grow. It's left the island and it hasn't yet made its way back. So the very last seed, the very last tree seems to have disappeared in the early 1960s, just in time, but not before an explorer named Thor Heyerdahl, who wrote a book called Kon-Tiki, about how his theory was that people from South America had populated the Pacific by going eastward rather than coming west from Polynesia. Thor Heyerdahl collected these seeds, took them back to Sweden, and then they ended up being circulated to different botanical gardens around the world. So they grow in captivity, as it were, around the world, but they don't grow in the soil on Easter Island, or Rapa Nui, as it's called. I gave a talk just last week up at Stanford to a group about the tree, and I realized I never said the word Easter Island. I just kept saying Rapa Nui, and I think people had no idea what that was, but that's the native name of Easter Island, which is this tree in the middle, this owned by Ecuador, governed by Ecuador, out in the middle of the Pacific. So anyway, that's so to continue, the Toromiro it can't take root in the soil anymore for reasons that are somewhat difficult to make sense of. But all that to say, it grows around the world, but it doesn't seem to grow on its native land, which is a problem trying to solve.
Okay, that's a problem that is because you want to bring the tree back to its roots, so to speak.
Exactly, so to speak.
Yeah.
Right.
And how did was it pollination? Obviously, it might have been that. How did it move physically from one place to another? It's hard to get my head around.
Well, one of my theories about the Toromiro is that, tsunamis, big wave events, carried it off of these islands are fairly low elevation. So when a tsunami, a big tidal wave hits the island, any island that's low lying, it just scrapes it clean of its plant life, and so the Sophora genus, which is the family that the Toromiro is in, the Sophora genus probably has about 40 species in it. So they're all very similar. They're quite similar, and so they've been scattered around the Pacific. There's a Sophora. I'm going to get the name wrong if I try to say it. Chris something in Hawaii. So they're different. They're different species of this genus, and they've been scattered by wave events. During the big tsunami that hit Japan, I think in 2011, something like 200 other species have been identified as having floated from Japan to other parts of the Pacific Rim. So wave action is a powerful transmitter of life to other places.
And how does all of this link to your own story in Hawaii? You also write about the fact that you've moved.
So that was a bit of a personal story, yeah. So I was as I said, born and raised in Hawaii, and I left to go to college. And but I'm not a native Hawaiian. I'm not of Hawaiian extraction. I don't have any Hawaiian blood. But I was born and raised there, and so I think it's fair to say that I was, if not a native, I was a local. So you get this sort of these complex layers of identity when it comes to being from a place that your ancestors might not have been from, but that you were born in and raised in. And so leaving that to go to the mainland, I really also felt like an expat in a way. And so I tell a few personal stories. I found that some readers really like those stories and others really dislike the stories. They're like, stick to the trees. Why aren't you talking more about the trees? And so,
No, I think that's as a reader, and I'm not telling this because you're on the show, there is another book by Turning to Stone by Dr. Marcia Bunerud.
What a great book.
And she was kind enough to join me for a podcast, and she also writes about these personal stories intertwined, because in the end it's not about rocks. You're reading about the person discovering them over time, so it makes it a little more human is how I'd see it. So I think it's more on your next book. I hope you bring more of that.
Thank you. You just can't escape the human dimension. We're all humans. We all bring our humanness to the things that we read, and it's the lens that we refract our interests and our knowledge through. And for my money, I think it's important to be able to tell a full three-dimensional story by including a human dimension. It's very journalistic, which is how I like to write. So I appreciate you saying that.
No, absolutely. And how can we not talk about sandalwood, because you're talking to an Indian,
of course,
and it means a lot to folks here. I know of a chess player in India, just for a little trivia. His name is Pragananda, and he goes by the name Prag. He was the youngest to beat Magnus Carlsen in 2022.
Wow,
if
really?
My memory serves me right. And his mum would send him to tournaments with a little sandalwood mark on the forehead, and he was asked in one of his interviews, why do you do that? He just said, it's my mom does it, it's for good luck. So, and of course, when the kids go to exams, to take their exams, whether they are 7-year-olds, 10-year-olds, or 15, you may find them with that mark on the forehead as good omen.
So interesting. I think the thing that's true about sandalwood that your story says is that it really has deeply saturated Indian culture, and it's done it for an extraordinarily long time too, for thousands of years. And so you just can't, it's everywhere in a sense, and it's played kind of an essential role, that's helped, it's helped millions of people through both folk and modern medicine, is the thing about the oil in particular, so it's a remarkable cultural story. And that's the other thing, as someone who's not from India, and and I had to do that one at a distance. I couldn't get there. I really admire its grip on culture and society and science, and I would have had an even better perspective if I could have visited India and seen it there. But I think I tell a pretty competent story about its role in India and the challenges that it's confronted with, and so on. So I've tried to keep it, despite the fact that a lot of these chapters about trees talk about the products of the tree, perhaps more than the tree. I've really tried to keep the tree still, fairly front and center in every one of these stories. The one exception is probably the fossil tree, because simply we know a lot about the amber, but we simply don't know that much about the tree. But I put everything that we know about that tree into that chapter. So, you're sometimes limited by the tree itself in terms of what you could say about the tree, but its products are as much a part of the tree as the tree itself, right? And so I figured that was fair game to include,
And you don't spend a lot of time explaining the biology behind it all with jargons which maybe folks can't understand, which is a good thing. But if I were to put you on a spot, Dr. Lewis, to explain bits of parts of a tree, what does stomata do, the flat plates and the chlorophyll, can you explain that in simple words? Because it's a complicated organism where it has to, and the size of some trees is huge, as we've just spoken about. So how do all of these work in symphony for it to stay alive for centuries?
Well, if I really had to simplify it, because you kind of have to generalize about these things, because there are many different complicated botanical mechanizations at play in trees. And so trees, as a recent, right, this is not my phrase, it's the title of a recent book, but trees are really light-eating machines. That's what they are. They eat light and water is the way to think about it, and it requires both of those things. All trees need light for photosynthesis. Not every single tree. There are a few exceptions of trees that don't photosynthesize, but they're very, very rare, and they all need some sort of moisture to grow. And so if you think about them as light-eating and water-eating machines, because they're like a machine in a sense, things are put into motion, they pull, the tallest trees like the coast redwood can pull water, has to pull a couple million pounds worth of pressure up into the tops of these trees, and it's probably the limiting factor for the tallest trees is how much it's able to actually pull. I mean, if you suck water through a straw, it's not hard for you and I to get a nice refreshing drink, but if you're a tree and you have to suck water through a 390-foot straw, very different. And you and I would be confronted with that if we were in some situation where there was a glass of water and we had a straw that long and we had to take a drink. I guarantee you we could not. We'd never get that water up to our mouth along that 380, 390 feet. So, so it helps to think about them as machines. I wrote a piece for Time magazine about this too after the book came out, about how trees are constructed, was the word I used in that article. Trees are constructions in the sense that they're constructed in that evolutionary processes have led to their being certain ways, I suppose, is I think what I was the point I was trying to get across. I think I talked about trees being engineered in a sense, not by a deity, in my particular view of things, but by all the forces that trees are subjected to. And evolution is fascinating to me. It's messy, it's inconsistent, it's irregular, and every single thing is in the process of turning into something else. Every living thing, all the time, because of natural selection or genetic drift or other changes in the environment or mutations. We just can't see the really fine details, and that's how, of course, trees came about. As they evolved from a smaller corpus of trees, they differentiated and they evolved, and that's how all of the natural world has come along, is through this, as Darwin described it, this branching tree of life. And so I find everything about evolution absolutely fascinating, because there's still things we don't know about it. There are a million kind of reflections of how evolution works and the kinds of things that it has done to turn the living world into this extraordinarily dynamic place, and Darwin hit the nail on the head when he wrote The Origin of Species in November of 1859 in an edition of 1,250 copies. And in a way, it really changed our views of the natural world. And so if I was a better prepared, I'd have a copy of one. We have 4 copies of that book, the first edition. I wave it in front of the camera. But evolution really is the wizard behind the curtain for trees, I suppose, is one way to think about it.
Yeah, because you've also written about birds, and one thing that I found was magical, although its evolution was. Have you heard of this? The crows in Japan. I don't know which city where they would drop their nuts, the hard nuts on the ground for the red signal, and then they would wait for the green light, and then the cars would run over them, wait for
Yeah.
the red one, then along with the folks who would cross the road, they would just walk in, nibble on the thing inside the nut and fly away. And because they evolved from dropping these nuts from high altitudes onto rocks, hoping that the nuts would break, and
Right.
today they figured out that they can use vehicles as their medium to help them eat.
Yeah.
Are there any such equivalents in the tree world that you found were that is quite fascinating? And
Yeah,
can-
it's tricky to people resist anthropomorphizing about the natural world. They say these are like humans. In fact, so birds. I'll use the bird example for a minute longer. Then I will give you a tree example. But birds are. I mean, it used to be we thought only humans were able to use tools, or primates. Well, birds use tools too. They use long branches. They can pick insects out of nests. They can do the things like you mentioned, the crows. The corvid family is extraordinarily intelligent in terms of what we understand to be intelligence. Things about trees that I found fascinating was, see if I can get this story right on the fly, because it's been a few months since I've read this, but they discovered a tree that had been cut down, and they discovered that trees around it somehow had connected their roots with this tree to provide it with nutrients, even though it had been cut down. They was sort of this group effort to protect this tree and keep it alive. And so, if you wanted to anthropomorphize it, you might call that, I don't know what you'd call it. You might call it, teamwork or something. You might call it love of your fellow tree. I don't think that is quite right, but I think it is pretty well established now that trees work symbiotically with each other to survive. I think that's probably the best way to put it in terms of and I find those kinds of cooperations fascinating, the ways that trees do it without becoming overly sentimental about it. I think it's still no less magical for the fact that it is something that trees do, and we don't have to equate them. Not everything has to be taken from a human perspective. Trees do these things on their own, and so there's a sort of cooperative aspect in the natural world that I find both hopeful and fascinating.
And well, humans have included puns and metaphors and idioms around trees for a number of years. One, I think I use this very often, knock on wood, if somebody
Knock on
says
wood.
something good, or strong as oak, to talk about
Exactly.
someone's character or build in terms of their physique.
Right.
Any
Right.
that come to mind for you?
There's so many. We find root causes for things.
Oh, yeah.
We're stumped. We can't figure things out. We leaf through books, which works with my analogy of trees and books being analogous to each other. There's so many, and every language has their own tree idioms like that. Let's think of some others. I bet we can think of a few others that are tree related. It became a common practice among my friends to try to come up with these in conversations over dinner, and because there's so many of them.
Right.
We can't see the forest for the trees. That's another
Yes.
one that is a very common expression in English. We have a knotty problem. Well, that's what they're referring to, are tree knots. Or we have a thorny problem.
Yeah.
And so there's so many. Yeah, it just shows
Barking
you how
up the wrong
embedded.
tree.
Barking up the wrong tree. That's a good one. There you go. There's
Yeah.
bark and tree in that.
Yeah,
in
absolutely.
that
And
one.
what is that? The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, or some such
That's
as
a
well,
good one
right?
too. Right,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
Referring to, idioms are fascinating too. I mean, referring to the fact that, say, an offspring of somebody is very similar to their parent. An apple doesn't fall
Right.
far from the tree. The apple is in the eye of the what's the expression? Where they say she's the apple of my eye. So all
Oh,
these
yeah.
tree parts, show up, as well as direct tree references. All the sort of products of trees show up all the time in these idioms. She's the flower, she's in the flower of her life, she's and so on. So there's botanical metaphors they're everywhere. So much to write a book of botanical metaphors.
Yeah, and one of my father's favorite ones was when I was growing up. Do you think money grows on trees?
Yeah,
So
sure.
That's one.
Yeah, I heard that from my dad too.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's right.
So, and this the last section and a more serious one, Dr. Lewis, is that of climate change. You can't, of course, there is one leader of an economy who talks about or has talked about it being a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese. But there is absolutely no debate on the subject anymore from all the evidence that points to it. How is climate change and trees interlinked? It's a big, subject, but maybe a 3-minute explanation about where we stand and what can we do to avert this.
So I think in a nutshell, there's another idiom. In a nutshell,
Yeah.
I think that the more trees we have, the better. And I think people have engaged in sort of tree planting campaigns for a long time, but trees aren't really good at sequestering carbon until they're maybe 20 years old. So you have to get started as soon as possible, and you have to let them keep growing. They have to be planted in the right conditions, and they have to be able to get to where they can do the work that will benefit the environment. I was careful about these trees because there's very little overlap in their range. And climate change has lots of different kinds of effects, right? It has temperature effects. It does things like, and the temperature effects in turn have other effects. So they raise the mosquito vector higher and higher and higher in tropical islands to where birds can't get away from these, and then avian malaria is transmitted by mosquitoes. But in terms of trees, it's hard to generalize too much about climate change. We know that a warming planet is difficult on trees. The bristlecone pine, which is the first tree in the book, is influenced by climate change because of the fact that these beetles that used to infest it, it's cold up at high elevations where this tree grows. The beetles that infested it couldn't get a foothold every year because it was too cold, maybe every other year or so. As it got warmer, they were arriving every year, and that became very hard on the trees because they had no time to recover. So I think there are a lot of things we can do to kind of test trees for their survival. And again, here's where humans come in, and the hope is that scientists are benevolent actors and try to do things that really will test what can survive in a warming climate and make some judicious modifications to these trees in ways that give them a chance to live. Because we have screwed up the planet, and I think it's hard to disagree with that. And I think now it falls to us to try to fix it. And of course, the devil's in the details, right? What we do to try to save trees involves lots of different kinds of challenges. So that's a pretty broad generalization, but there's a lot we can do, and I think I give a lot of details in the book from tree to tree about what kinds of things we might do to help trees. But learn about them, get out there and be involved in their care. Be interested in their botany and their biology, learn about them and spend time in the natural world. And there's no substitute for doing that to really come to appreciate trees and thus become someone who might actually be a helpmate to help trees survive.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Dr. Lewis. On that note, it's time to wrap this podcast up. Thanks so much for your time, and congratulations yet again on 12 trees and all the accolades.
Abhishek, thank you so much. It's been my pleasure.